Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest in a series of Bogtastic Webcasts from Moors for the Future partnership. And this is part of our More Life 2020 project, which is funded by the EU Life Programme, Yorkshire Water, United Utilities and Severn Trent. And we're doing this series of webcasts while we can't get out and about to talk to people in the flesh, so hope you enjoy it. If you're watching live today, you can post questions in the chat bar at the right. So it'd be lovely if you could say hi, and we'll also be putting some quizzes and some handouts up, so look out for those. If you do have any issues with video or sound, we recommend that you press the refresh button and that should sort it out. If not, then tell us in the chat bar and we'll see what we can do to help. So my name's Jodie. I'm here today with Tia Crouch, and she is one of Moors for the Future Partnership's Senior Research and Monitoring Officers. And we're going to be talking today about her experiments to establish the best way of planting sphagnum on the moors. We'll be having a chat for about 25 minutes, and then after that there'll be an opportunity to answer some questions. So feel free to post your questions as we go along, and we'll answer them as many of them as we can at the end. So hi Tia.
Hi.
First of all, historically, sphagnum cover on the moors in the Peak District and South Pennines has basically kind of been decimated. And so can you tell us what we're doing about this at Moors for the Future, please?
Yeah, of course. So a lot of our work previously has really focused on stabilising bare peat. And that's not always, well, while that's a really fantastic start, sometimes we need to do a little bit more intervention to kind of help things along. So blanket bogs have a really special plant community, and one of the most important species that we need on a blanket bog is sphagnum. And the reason for that really is for it to be an active blanket bog, we need peat to be forming, and sphagnum is one of the best species really for building peat. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of sphagnum, or there hasn't been a lot of sphagnum on these moorlands in the Peak District. And this is mainly a sort of legacy of atmospheric pollution, which killed off a lot of the sphagnum. And so there's not a source really for natural recolonization to happen. So we need to do a bit more intervention to help things along. And there's a few different ways that this can be done. So that's really the topic really for today's webcast.
Lovely, thank you. So what are we looking at here then?
So here we're looking at what we'd really like to see. So we've got some really lovely sphagnum there. So on a healthy, active blanket bog, you'd have a really nice mix of species. So here you've got some sphagnum mixed in with some common cotton grass and some heather.
Lovely. And so we are looking at different ways that we can introduce sphagnum onto the moors. So I gather you did an experiment to try and work out what was the best way. So could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, of course. So if we just move on to the next slide. So back in 2015, we had some money through a project called the Peatland Restoration Project, funded through DEFRA and administered through the Environment Agency. And through that project, we were able to set up this trial to look at which propagule type, and by propagule I mean just any sort of plant material from which a plant can grow. So which one of these types of propagules was most successful? And we looked at it in terms of establishment, survival, and then how they spread it as well. So this image that we've got in front of us now shows the 4 different types of sphagnum propagules that were used in the trial. So the first one is sphagnum gel, or rather we've got sphagnum gel and beads and plugs. So those are all types of cultivated sphagnum, propagated sphagnum. So if we start by looking at the beads actually, so those ones are made from just tiny fragments of sphagnum that's encapsulated in a substance and formed into a bead. The
So they
sphagnum,
look a bit like peas, don't they?
they do, yeah, a little bit smaller, a bit more
Yeah.
squishy maybe.
And what was the design of them? I guess the idea was that you could kind of throw them
Yeah,
out.
well, I think originally actually there was a hope that they might have been able to be spread from the air, so that
Right.
was where that idea came from. But I think just in terms of I guess how squishy they are, when that was tried, they just clogged up the hopper, the
Right.
machinery that was being used to spread them. So when those have been used, they are just spread by hand. So someone will walk along with a bucket and take a handful and just spread them as they walk.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sphagnum gel is very similar. It's made of slightly larger fragments of sphagnum, and it's kind of suspended in this substance which helps with water holding capacity, so it doesn't dry out as quickly once it's applied. Moving on to the other side, so we've got sphagnum plugs. So that is essentially just a small plant. It's about the size of a 50p piece when it goes in. And the really nice thing about these propagated forms of sphagnum is they contain a mixture of species. So actually all of those contain 12 species of sphagnum. The last one down at the bottom there is translocated sphagnum clumps. So this is just sphagnum that's harvested from an existing site and then transported to wherever you want to plant it. And yeah, just grows from that. Those are bigger than the plugs. So usually when we're harvesting sphagnum, we'll take about a handful.
Okay, so we've said that there isn't much, or there wasn't historically much sphagnum growing in the Peak District and South Pennines because of various factors that have kind of decimated it. So where would those clumps come from, and is it okay to use them?
Yeah, so for the sphagnum trial that we're talking about today, the translocated clumps actually came from Kinder, just a little bit, not on the plateau, but a bit further down the slope. There was some sphagnum growing, so we harvested it from there and just walked it up onto the site. But we did actually do another project as well, which looked at how well sphagnum will recover from harvesting. So this is my colleague Gemma Benson, and she's up on a site called Robinson's Moss in the Longdendale Valley. And in this project, which did require landowner permission and Natural England consent, and that's all really just to check that we're not doing anything damaging to the site, so it's all got proper approval. And we harvested sphagnum, again, taking those handfuls. So within a 1 by 1 metre area, we were taking about 10% of the sphagnum. We monitored it over 3 years to see how it recovered. After 3 years, it had recovered by about 57% to its original density. And so from that, we are assuming that within about 5 years, a site would be fully recovered. So as long as you're not taking too much and you're not doing it too frequently, we have been able to show that, the sphagnum, the donor sites, if you like, do recover. But as you say, we are limited in sites with sphagnum on that have enough sphagnum to harvest from in the Peak District.
Okay, lovely. So, so with those 4 options available, you did a study to decide which one would work best, and from that, it's kind of helped us decide how to plant sphagnum on a large scale. So, can you talk us through the study that you did, please?
Yeah, we'll just move on to the next slide. So the study was set up on Kinder Scout,
Mm-hmm.
and the coloured area, the sort of pink and blue, and then with all the multicoloured areas as well, that's the north edge of Kinder.
Yeah, which people will be familiar with from if you've watched Tom's webcast from a couple of weeks ago. We've got a lot of experimental work going on up there, haven't we? So
yes, yeah, we have. There's been a lot of work done on that site. Initially through an environmentally sensitive area scheme, and then later on through the Making Space for Water project, and then following on from that, the peatland restoration project.
And continuing on in More Life 2020.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So, as I said, it's the north edge of Kinder Scout. You'll see there are 3 areas with sort of a pink line around them. So we had 3 replica areas that we used for the trial. The reason that we use replicates really important in experimental design, basically just to check that, you know, that if perhaps one of those propagule types hadn't done so well in one area, it's not just because you've put it in a less good area and that's the reason it's not grown. So by replicating the experiment, we can be a lot more confident in our results. Then within each of those 3 areas, there are 5 smaller areas, all nicely brightly coloured, and those represent the different propagule types. So within each area, we've got a smaller area that's treated with one of the 4 propagule types, and then the 5th area acts as a control, so it doesn't get any sphagnum at all. And again, that's another really important aspect of experimental design. And in this case, it tells me, so if no sphagnum grows in that control, but I've got sphagnum growing in my other areas, I can be really confident that the sphagnum that's growing has come from our intervention, and it's not just that sphagnum's coming back naturally. So then lastly, just on this, within each of those brightly coloured areas, we put down 10 quadrats, and then those were treated with sphagnum, and we can monitor over time how the sphagnum's doing, basically.
Great. So you've got, it might be hard for people to see, but for example, you've got what are they? What's the yellow?
I think the brown is the plugs, the blue is the clumps.
Yeah.
So
you've got 3 of each, and you've done the same treatment in an area. So each of those coloured areas, roughly what size are they?
They're all about a hectare.
Okay.
So they're based on sort of hydrological units. So a nice discrete area where there's not going to be any danger that they're not too close together. So if water flows through them, it's not going to flow into one of the other areas and potentially transport, I don't know, beads from one into one that's been treated with plugs. So that's
they're
why
kind of mini bowls or mini catchments.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Just lastly to say as well, you might notice there's a little pink area that's about in the middle of the map. That area wasn't part of this trial, it was part of a separate trial. And in that one, that's again a hectare, so quite a small area about the size of a football pitch. And we planted 36,550 plugs or thereabouts in there. So the idea with that trial was to see how quickly we could get comprehensive sphagnum cover. So
and you're going to tell
all
us
of the ground covered.
You're going to tell us a bit more about that later on.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So just for people watching, there's now an opportunity to download the Making Space for Water report and also the Sphagnum donor site monitoring report. So if you press download, they come up in a different tab. So you're welcome to have a look at those afterwards if you like. So I think it's time for our first quiz. So what we want to know is you've done these trials, which ones work best? So let's give people an opportunity to see what they think, and then we'll hear what the results are. So I think a quiz will be coming up shortly.
Yeah, so just of those, the 4 different propagule types, the beads, the gel, the plugs and the hummocks, which one do you think has been most successful in covering the biggest amount of ground?
We've got a few answers coming in. Okay, quite a few different answers. Most people are saying sphagnum plugs. A few are saying gel. 3 have said gel. 1 has said bead, and 3 have said translocated plugs. So let us know what the answer is, Tia?
Yeah, we'll move on to the next slide and have a look at the results.
See how people did.
Yeah. So to start off by saying that they all worked to, they all worked a bit, and actually the results from the plugs and the translocated clumps was very, very close. But in terms of the most successful, it was plugs. So if we look at the first graph, actually, so the one that says bead gel and control on it, so you can see there that, as what I was saying about the control, if we get no sphagnum growing in it, we got a tiny bit, 0.2%, but that's not really anything to be concerned about. So we can be really confident that the sphagnum that is growing is from the treatments that we've applied. Beads and gel, so we started off with a percent cover of 0 because really they're not little plants when you put them down. They take a little bit of time to grow, and so beads covered the least area after 3 years, so it got up to 0.8%. The gel was actually quite a bit more successful, so that got up to just above 10%. But if we look at the second graph, so the orange line is the clumps, the translocated sphagnum clumps, and the sort of bluey purpley line is the plugs. We tried to put the same amount, so we tried to start off with the same percentage cover at the start, but that was reasonably tricky to do. So the clumps actually did have a higher percentage cover to start with as well. So they started off at just under 8% cover, and that rose to just over 36% after 3 years. And the plugs started off at 2%, and that rose to just over 40% after 3 years. So
Great.
overall, in terms of the amount of ground covered, the plugs just topped it, really.
Just one. And I'll just point out that the scale on the graphs is different. So that's why you've got two different graphs, because the scales had to be slightly different, didn't they? Because
Yes.
the plugs and clumps made were so much more successful.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
So if you answered sphagnum plugs or sphagnum clumps in that poll, then well done. But thanks for your input. So I think the next thing we were going to talk about was then that's not the only thing to take into consideration. We've got to also take into consideration the cost. And so we've got another poll, very similar question, but this time taking into consideration the cost as well. Are we doing the poll now, Tia?
Yeah, please. Yeah, so it's taking into consideration cost and the cover of sphagnum. If you think about both of those things, then which propagule type do you think is the most successful? See if bringing the cost in changes what you think about it.
Interesting. So we've got a lot of people saying translocated sphagnum clumps. One saying plugs. I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Yeah, we've got quite a few answers in now. A few people saying gel, one person saying plugs, and all the rest are translocated clumps. So is that right here? Are people right? Are clumps the cheapest?
Yeah.
And,
well, very close actually. Yeah. So if we just flip on to the next slide. So the graph there, the blue bars show you percent cover for each of the propagule types, and then the orange line that's going through it shows you the cost. So you've got the cost on the bar on one side and percentage cover on the other. And what I had to do to try and work this out is we ended up working out the cost per 1% cover of sphagnum, which is the last column in the table at the top there. So beads were the most expensive, and clumps, but very close, was gel as well. So you're looking at 9p per 1% cover of sphagnum from clumps and 10p for gel, and then plugs that they're doing pretty well in there as well. So it's not even though they're the most expensive, what the results that you get from them put them in quite a good position when you start looking at that cost benefit comparison.
So why do the clumps cost at all?
So you still need people to do the harvesting. So yeah, sorry, I should have said these costs are based on that specific project. So that might vary if you were working on another project, and also time, like the prices will have changed over time. But those costs do take into account sort of the production of them, if they are propagated sphagnum, and also the application costs or and the harvesting costs if you're actually harvesting clumps from somewhere and then transporting them onto site. And that cost wasn't massive for the clumps in this project because, as I'd said before, we harvested them from Kinder, sort of just further down the slope, and then walked them up. Whereas if you were perhaps taking them from another site and then they needed to be brought up by helicopter or something, then that cost might go up. So these costs are specific to that project. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think many people watching this will know that we do tend to use the plugs in nearly all our conservation work, Moors for the Future's conservation work. What was the reasoning? Why did we decide to do that?
Yeah, so cost and success really aren't, they're obviously very important, but there are other factors to consider as well. So the gel, for instance, that's obviously done very well in the cost benefit analysis. But just to give you a little bit of insight, when we applied the gel to the quadrats, we actually did it using a turkey baster. So we're on hands and knees and sort of squeezing this gel like down through the vegetation to make sure it made contact with the peat. And again, it goes back to this sort of application method. We touched on it a little bit with the beads, but with the gel, there was a hope that we could sort of spray it over the moors and it would be quite efficient. But the problem with that is, even though it's in this substance that helps it hold water, if it just catches on the vegetation, then it's not going to grow and it is going to dry out before it perhaps makes contact with the peat. So that's, if you are going to use gel for something, then you kind of need to think about how it's going to be applied. And then if we move on to plugs, obviously they've done pretty well in that cost benefit comparison, but there are also some other benefits which do apply to all of the propagated forms of sphagnum. And those are, you can control which species you have. So when you're harvesting sphagnum, you're probably quite limited in terms of the species that you'll find. Whereas with the propagated sphagnum, you only need a very small amount of material from which you can propagate. And you can also ensure that that's a kind of clean sample, if you like. So it reduces the risk of introducing any diseases if you're moving material that you may have if you were moving material from one site to another site. And lastly, it goes back to the supply. So you're not really limited in how much you can make. So for instance, last year we planted over 1 million plugs onto the moorlands, and I just don't think that would be feasible if we were using just translocated sphagnum.
Yeah, okay, lovely, fascinating. So I know that you also did some work in that little pink bit that you showed us about planting loads of plugs really intensively on a small area. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that, because I think there's some stuff about where you plant them and which types of sphagnum grow best in certain places. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, just move on to the next slide.
Thank you.
So in that area, so it's like over 36,000 plugs. So that worked out to be about 5 per, sorry,
My mistake.
so that worked out to be about 5 per metre square. With the trial that we've mainly been focusing on today, so that Propagule trial, we tried to plant the sphagnum where we thought it would be happy and where it would have the best chance of surviving. with this trial, we just blanketed that area as much as we could. So that meant that it got, the sphagnum was planted on the sort of higher, drier hag areas, as well as the sort of wetter, potentially more favourable areas that we've referred to here as undulating ground. So as you can see from this first graph, the topography, so whether it's planted higher up or lower and wetter, has a really big effect on how well it does. So the percentage cover was very similar to start with, and on these drier sort of hag tops, after 3 years we're up to about 11% cover, whereas in the wetter areas we're up to over 50% cover. You'll also see, so that the light purple line is the hag tops, the plugs that were planted on the hag tops. If you look towards the end of that line, you can see it just drops down a little bit as well, and that was 2018, so that was the drought year. So what that tells us really is that those plants that were put on hag tops are not as able to be resilient if we do go through a dry period, whereas those that are in the wetter areas sort of bounce back a bit more quickly.
So does that inform what we do on a large scale when we're planting sphagnum as part of our conservation works?
Yeah, so generally we would try and put sphagnum in. I mean, sphagnum does like wet.
Bog moth.
Yeah. So, like generally speaking, if you can press your heel down into the ground and you can see some water coming up, then that's going to be a nice area for it. And it also likes a little bit of shelter, so if you can kind of nestle it in by maybe a tussock of cotton grass, then it's going to be a lot happier than if it's like out in the middle of a area of bare peat or something like that where it has no shelter.
Okay, thanks. And then the other graph is showing how different species did. So
yes, yeah. So what we generally see to begin with, the proportions of the different species that go into the mix of propagated sphagnum, it varies. So there's quite a lot of phalax, quite a lot of some of the other species, and then the slightly more rare species, they occur in the mix in a lower proportion. And generally speaking, that's what we see when the plugs start to grow and when we're able to start telling what species are coming from them. They start to come through in those proportions. But you can see, again, hag tops here in this graph is blue, and the undulating ground, those wetter areas, are in red. And there is a difference in the species, which makes perfect sense really, because the different species of sphagnum tend to occur along a gradient from sort of wetter to drier. So you've got those that very much have to be in water, things like cuspedatum. Phalax also likes it quite wet, but it is a bit more of a generalist species, so it will grow where it's a bit drier as well. So for the hag tops, we've got sort of 4 species that are dominating, and those are capillifolium, and we'll see some pictures of these in a minute. Phalax, palustre, and papillosum. And then for the undulating ground, we've really got 2 species that are dominating more there, so phalax and palustre, and those are species that do like it to be a bit wetter.
Lovely, thank you. And so just kind of lastly, you're going to tell us a little bit about the work you're doing now to actually kind of see if we can identify sphagnum on a really large scale by using aerial observation, Earth observation.
Yes, yeah. So for those of you that have been involved in sphagnum ID, you'll know it's quite difficult anyway, even when you're looking at it with your eye. So it's a challenging project, and we don't know whether we will be able to do it or not. But as part of the More Life 2020 project, we've been collecting Earth observation data. So that's either from a drone with cameras attached to it, or manned aircraft, similarly with cameras attached, to get aerial photography. And then we're working with Nottingham Trent University actually, so they do the analysis of the data for us, and they've been using sort of image classification software, to come up with land cover maps. And we're trying to see whether it's possible to tell any of those species apart using Earth observation and those techniques as well. So it might be, and it's likely we won't be able to tell all of them apart, but we may perhaps be able to tell the sort of more redder sphagnums from the green sphagnums. And yeah, it's a interesting and challenging project.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I think while we have these beautiful pictures of these kind of single species areas that you've planted, it's time for a fun poll for people to choose their favourite peat forming sphagnum species. So yeah, if you'd like to cast your votes. Oh gosh. I put a cheeky question
I
at
know,
the
I
end,
just saw
so
that. I hadn't seen that one before.
I hope you don't mind. Just on a whim, all sphagnum is awesome, and sure enough, we have a lot of sphagnum fans in the house today. 14 people are saying all sphagnum is awesome, and then yeah, Magellanicum. I don't know about you, but it's just the name of Magellanicum. I like it sounds like magic. So thanks for
Yeah,
that.
it has actually changed its name as well. So it's actually sphagnum medium now, which isn't quite as exciting. So stuck with Magellanicum for this.
So thank you, Tia. I think we've covered most of, well, I mean, a very whistle-stop tour of some of your work. So thank you very much for that. And we've got time for a few questions. So have I missed anything out, Tia?
No, I don't think so.
Are we ready to go
Yeah,
to some questions?
absolutely.
So first of all, we have a question from George. Have there been any changes in organic carbon in the soils where planting has taken place?
Tricky
one to measure.
Tricky one. Yeah, it's not something that we measure actually. So we do look at, we've got a couple of methods that we use for monitoring carbon loss from the moorlands. And that tends to be for dissolved organic carbon, we can look at it in the water that's coming off the hill. And in terms of particulate, so like the bigger particles of water, it's very difficult to pick that up in water samples because unless you're actually out on the hill when there's a storm going on, which is when you get those bigger particles coming off, you tend not to pick it up in the water samples. So we have another technique that we use that looks at you know, how much carbon's being lost from the hills using these little tube devices. And if you want any more information about that, then I'm happy to sort of go into that I can send you some information in an email perhaps. But in terms
That
of
was also
actually
covered briefly in Tom's webcast
okay.
as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll be able to email you some stuff over.
Yeah, but actually in the peat itself, I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid. But I can try and have a little look into that afterwards for you, see if any of my colleagues know.
Lovely, thank you. And we've got a question from Steve saying, have you tested approaches to reintroducing sphagnum into swards of Areophorum as well as onto bare peat? Did I say that right?
Areophorum, yeah. So
What's that?
cotton grass.
I should know.
Okay. So yes, bare peat, we tend not to reintroduce sphagnum onto bare peat. So we tend to do all of the other stuff first. So, you know, you're brushing, reseeding, stabilizing the peat. And then once there's some vegetation cover, then at that point, that's when we would reintroduce the sphagnum. So it tends to be sort of later on in the process. I know it's sometimes different on lowland bogs, but in the uplands, that's how we tend to do it. And in terms of different vegetation types, that is something that we're looking at in More Life 2020. So we, More Life 2020, we kind of focused on sites that are that are dominated by certain species. So we've got monitoring sites set up on sites dominated by cotton grass, by heather and by purple moor grass. And then we've got these making space for water, our old sites that we've brought in. So they're our sort of bare peat starting state, but they're not currently bare peat. They have got lots of vegetation growing on them now. So yeah, that's a kind of ongoing project. Those plugs only went in last March. So this year will be the first sort of post intervention monitoring data that we will collect, and that should give us a good idea of how sphagnum does in different types of vegetation. It's a bit of a watch this space for that one.
Yeah, I've pasted the project page into the chat. It doesn't have loads of results on it, but it gives a bit of an overview of what we're doing in that vegetation diversification. So thanks for that, Tia. We're a bit low on time. We're running over slightly, so we'll try for a couple more questions, if that's okay with you, Tia.
Yeah, that's fine.
If you do have to disappear off, then thanks very much for watching, and watch this space. We're having another session in a couple of weeks. So George says, what is the effect of weather on the gel and beads, such as wet or dry conditions?
So I don't know that we have. It would probably be anecdotal evidence that I'm giving you rather than anything, based on studies that we've done. Ideally, you'd want it to go down when it's wet. You wouldn't want to put it down and then have a drought. I think that would be not so great, particularly I think for the gel, just because if it does get caught on vegetation, it's likely to dry out. The beads, I think, are slightly heavier, so they're perhaps more likely to make contact with the ground. But yeah, ideally, you'd want to put them down when the weather's relatively cool and damp, and not in the middle of summer. But that goes for any sphagnum, really, not just the gel and the beads, even the plugs and the clumps. If you put them in and then there's a drought, they're not going to be all that happy. You want to give them a bit of time to establish before they suffer some dry weather. I mean, at the moment, a lot of our sphagnum's looking quite crispy, but we've seen, from 2018, it gets really bleached. It's amazing stuff, really, because it'll get really bleached, really dried out, and then as soon as it gets some rain on it again, it just sort of bounces back. It's incredible, really.
Lovely. I think we should leave it there. So thanks to the people who have asked some really interesting questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer all of them, but we will try and get back to you with answers to all of those questions. And so I'd like to say thank you very much to Tia for that really fascinating insight into some of that kind of finer science of what we do with sphagnum and why we do it. I would like to just tell you that the next Bogtastic Webcast will be in 2 weeks' time on the 18th of June, and we'll be talking about moorland plant identification and when to see them at their finest. And so I'd just like to also say, thanks, Charlie, so that if you'd like to register, you can register on our virtual Bogtastic experience page. It's not up there quite yet, but it will be in the next couple of days. And you can also watch past webcasts on there as well. And so, yeah, finally, thank you very, very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, dear.